So this summer has been filled with so many different sports, and it's just been great to kind of see some crazy performances. But just breaking down a lot of these different sports, it's been interesting to see that there's been this one psychological skill that I feel has just been really important and has differentiated the winner from the loser. This psychological skill is pressure management. When we look at the NBA finals, when we look at the Euros and those penalty shootouts, even when we're looking at the Olympics, which is just coming up, I feel like pressure management is just so important and really can dictate who is going to dominate and win in those crazy situations. So in this video today, we are going to break down pressure management in more detail. We're going to explore why it's so important. We're going to give 2 tips for athletes on how they can better kind of use the psychological skill. And I'm also going to give an additional tip for coaches and what drills and activities they can do to better help their team or their athletes prepare for their performances and manage that pressure when they get to those crazy situations. So when we're looking at pressure in the field of sports, pressure can come from so many different areas. So it can come from your personal expectations, it can come from your teammates, coaches, it can come from fans, it can come from the media, it can come from so many different internal and external areas. And your ability to perceive that, if you perceive it to be important, then of course that's pressure. And then once you're in those crazy high stakes situations, those expectations and those sources of pressure are going to be factors that can really negatively impact your performance. If we look at the field of the NBA finals a month ago, we can see that the Boston Celtics did a great job of managing that pressure in the home games and the away games in the finals. And when the Mavericks were making a good run or a good play, Boston was still able to manage that pressure to then perform well and ultimately win the championship. When we look at the Euros, so many different penalty shootouts and penalty situations. We can see Portugal, for example. Cristiano Ronaldo didn't do a great job at first at managing his pressure to then perform a good technique for that penalty. But then when it got to the penalty shootouts a bit later in that match, we can see that the Portugal goalkeeper did great being able to manage that pressure, and that ultimately helped Portugal progress to that stage. So pressure just comes in so many different formats, and it really has been interesting to see how athletes kind of manage that pressure and manage that situation. So when we're talking about pressure management, it's the athlete's ability to perform the desired techniques that they want in that specific environment. Yes, they can perform it in training. Yes, they can perform it maybe at the early stages of their competition. But when the bright lights are on, when it's those high stakes situations, when it's win or go home, when it's the difference between maybe finishing 4th or getting a gold medal, can you still perform that specific technique? And that can be helped through pressure management. So my first tip for athletes is visualization. Visualization is a great technique that can help you produce that psychological skill of pressure management, as by mentally rehearsing the techniques that you're going to be performing, that can give you the confidence and the fluidity of movements to perform in those pressurized situations. A great example of that within the Olympics would be Michael Phelps. He was notorious for always visualizing his techniques, visualizing his swimming performance and him coming first in his mind, and that really helped him to produce that technique in those bright lights, crazy situations, which ultimately helped him to then get all those gold medals. So there's a lot of research that supports kind of visualization helping with pressure management, and we can see that a lot of studies have shown that those people who are able to visualize and mentally rehearse their performance, that helps them heighten levels of confidence, helps them feel more psychologically prepared for their performance, and really helps them in their decision-making abilities when they're in those crazy pressurized situations. My second technique for athletes to use to kind of better help their pressure management abilities would be breathing techniques. Breathing techniques, they're really good. There's lots of different apps out there that really kind of talk about educating yourself around lots of different breathing techniques. But overall, your ability to use any of these breathing techniques helps you to calm your nerves, helps with levels of focus, and helps you to get in the right state with your arousal levels and your energy levels to then produce that specific technique. When we look at some examples in the field of basketball, we got LeBron James. We can see him in most of his matches before kind of getting onto the court. We can see him executing some breathing techniques, and that's helped him to kind of calm his nerves and actually produce that performance when the game starts. And for me, a breathing technique I think is great, and it's a technique that I teach my athletes that I work with, is 4-7-8 breathing. If you're interested, let me know. I'm happy to make a video on it, but that is a great breathing technique, and it really just helps athletes experience all these different benefits. And then when they get to these pressurized situations, they're better able to manage that pressure and produce those techniques that they do countless amount of times in training situations. So those two techniques are really helpful for athletes to perform in those pressurized situations. They can be done whilst performing. So if in basketball there's a timeout, or just before their performance in football, or in the Olympics just before you're about to start warming up, or just about to do your race or your activity. So those are great techniques if in those situations you are feeling pressure. However, being able to manage pressure is something that can be taught and developed whilst training. And so if you're a coach, or if you're an athlete as well in your training sessions, this is a technique or an activity that you can incorporate that better helps you to develop that psychological skill of pressure management within that training situation. So for all my coaches out there, a tip for you to better help your athletes manage pressure would be simulation training. Simulation training is a constrained training situation where you put lots of different variables in place that then simulate a pressurized situation. So maybe in the field of basketball, it's performing a certain amount of free throws, getting a certain amount in, and if you don't, then there's a massive consequence. And if you're in a team situation, that could be putting your athletes and your team in lots of different pressurized situations. Maybe having a practice match and there only being 1 or 2 minutes left on the clock, and your team is down by a goal or down by a couple baskets, and depending on what your sport is, putting them in those situations where they're feeling a bit of anxiety, they're feeling a bit of pressure, they're feeling the weight of their consequences if they don't perform those techniques well, that helps them become more accustomed to that pressure. Therefore, when you are in those pressurized situations, in real game situations, they're a lot more comfortable in those situations, and increases the likelihood of them being able to manage that pressure and perform those techniques that they do on a regular basis. Again, when we look at research supports this, it looks at simulation training really helping those people better manage their anxiety, maybe better manage frustration when things don't go their way and they have to bounce back, and it better helps with their decision making abilities. So overall, putting athletes in pressurized situations on the training ground and simulating those things, maybe having a discussion afterwards to see what they did well, what they didn't do well, and what they could do going forward, is very helpful to getting them comfortable in those situations when the real games come, and that helps them to better produce those pressure management abilities and hopefully come up with the win. So the athlete and the team's ability to manage pressure, I think, is just so important, especially in this summer. We're looking at finals, we're looking at semi-finals, we're looking at these high stakes situations in all these international tournaments that pressure has been felt on the weight of the country, and some teams and athletes have been able to manage that well, a lot of teams have not. So I'm looking forward to seeing this in the Olympics. Maybe you can see now in these pressurized situations, how do athletes respond? Are they using different psychological techniques to help them perform well? Are they just caving and not doing great at all? This will be interesting to see in this Paris Olympics, which are coming up, which I'm going to do a whole series on. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.